Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our study of the endocrine system. In this episode, we are going to go over the main hormones of all the endocrine glands of the body, what they do, how they work, and how they work together to help our bodies maintain homeostasis. So if you're ready, let's go. The first endocrine gland we are going to talk about is the hypothalamus, also sometimes called the boss gland, because it is going to be the coordinator of so many different endocrine activities that happen in the body. It's really kind of the one who sets the point or starts the relay race for homeostatic control in the body. And this is everything from thirst and hunger to thermoregulation, reproductive functions, fluid balance, sleep-wake cycle, you name it, it's probably coordinated by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is just a tiny little area of nervous tissue that's located inferior to the diencephalon and is connected to the pituitary gland that we're going to talk about soon. So while having direct functions on both the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands, it's essentially going to have indirect functions on getting other endocrine organs to do their thing. So for example, the hypothalamus is going to tell the anterior pituitary to release a hormone that will tell the thyroid gland what to release. So in that sense, it has an indirect function as well as direct functions. But overall, these are tropic functions in the sense that the hypothalamus is sending messages to other glands and telling them what they need to secrete. So that gives it a tropic function. But in essence, there are two main actions that the hypothalamus gland is going to have. Direct action via hypothalamic axon terminals in the posterior pituitary gland. So in other words, your pituitary gland, which we went over in the endocrine system, it sits in that sella turcica little bone feature of the sphenoid bone. And it has a front part called the anterior pituitary gland and a back part called the posterior pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus sits right above both of those, and it's going to send messages to the posterior pituitary gland via axons on neurons. So the cell bodies of those neurons are located in the hypothalamus, and that's where certain hormones are going to be produced. But they get sent down axons to the posterior pituitary in order for that gland to secrete them. So we'll talk more about that in just a little bit when we talk about the pituitary gland. But it can also have those indirect effects by sending hormones through the bloodstream, which we'll talk about in a second, and how that happens, to the anterior pituitary gland, telling it to produce and secrete particular hormones that will then target other glands. So we'll see exactly how this is done in just a little while when we talk more about the pituitary gland. But for now, know that the hypothalamus is the coordinator. It's the boss. It's the one that kind of sets these whole negative and positive feedback loops in motion. Now let's talk in a little more detail about the anatomy of the hypothalamus and how it's connected to the pituitary gland. So there's some pretty pictures here so you can kind of get a general sense. So there's the hypothalamus right there, and you can see it's connected to the pituitary gland, which consists of the anterior and the posterior parts. Here's another view of that. So hypothalamus up here, pituitary right there, and yet another view down here. Lots of pictures for you. Pick which one you like. Now, you notice that there's this little stalk connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary. That is called the infundibulum. Sounds fun, huh? Infundibulum. And so that is going to be kind of the information highway between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And so the way that the hypothalamus communicates with the posterior pituitary is slightly different than the way it communicates with the anterior. And I kind of mentioned that already. So the way it communicates with the anterior pituitary gland is through what's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. And that is quite a mouthful, isn't it? But hypothalamic hypophyseal, or physeal if you prefer, portal system. And so this is really a network of blood vessels. Specifically, when the hypothalamus wants to tell the anterior pituitary what to do, it will produce its hormones on the cell bodies of its axons, and then those hormones will then get taken up by capillaries in the hypothalamus, And those capillaries will then drain into veins in the infundibulum. And finally, they will reach the capillaries of the anterior pituitary gland. And from there, they're able to tell the anterior pituitary what hormones it needs to secrete. Now, as we said, the pituitary gland is located in the little sella turcica, the Turkish saddle bone feature of the sphenoid that you might have learned about when you were studying the skeletal system. And so both the posterior and the anterior parts of the pituitary gland sit there. Another name for the posterior pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis. So some books like to use that term. And the other term for the anterior part of the pituitary gland is the adenohypophysis. Now, one of the big differences between the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands is that the posterior is comprised of nervous tissue, whereas the anterior pituitary gland is composed of glandular epithelium that can produce hormones. So that's a big difference there. And the hypothalamus is going to send its messages to the posterior pituitary through neurological activity, through electrical activity that is sent down the axons of its neurons, whereas it's going to communicate with the anterior pituitary through a capillary network, a venular network called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So just to zoom in a little and recap what we just said about how the hypothalamus bosses the pituitary, if we zoom in a little more here, we see the hypothalamus gland and the cell bodies of its neurons that actually produce hormones. And so these little neurons here, these cell bodies, are called supraoptic or paraventricular nuclei. And again, for signals going to the posterior pituitary gland, the hormones produced in these nuclei will travel down this hypophyseal, this hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, and tell the posterior pituitary when to secrete them. Now, again, the posterior pituitary does not produce any hormones of its own. Contrast that with its little partner over here, the anterior pituitary, which is really its own thing, completely separate from the posterior, because it itself produces a lot of hormones that we'll be talking about, and it receives a signal from the hypothalamus through that portal system we just mentioned, which is vascular, right? It has blood. So it's going to receive those signals from the blood, and that's going to tell it to produce and secrete its own hormones that will go to the target cells. So now that you have a basic understanding of what the hypothalamus is and how it connects the pituitary gland, we are ready to go over the specific hormones that this amazing hypothalamus boss gland produces. And in general, we can break this into three main hormones. So one, antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, also known in many books as vasopressin. So if you hear vasopressin, it's the same thing as ADH, antidiuretic hormone. We're also going to talk about oxytocin and a third group, which is releasing and inhibiting hormones. I guess you could consider that four groups actually, right? Releasing hormones, inhibiting hormones. So there's a lot of them, but we're going to start off talking about ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And if you hear the term uretic or diuretic, you think of water, right? So ADH controls water balance in the body, or at least controls the things that control the water balance in the body. Overall, ADH is amazing. It's important. It's going to affect everything from water retention to blood pressure. Overall, it's going to decrease urine production in the kidneys. So decreasing urine production, and the reason for that is it's going to tell the body, specifically the kidneys, to retain water from those kidneys. Instead of sending that water out into the urine so that you pee a lot, you instead are going to have that water retained or reabsorbed into the body. And so how this happens, how does ADH cause this ultimate effect to happen? Well, it's going to send messages to the kidneys that tell the kidney tubules to increase the number of aquaporins in the plasma membrane of those kidney tubules. So aquaporins, and I'm showing them right here, They're proteins, of course, right? Like everything else. And they're really little channels. They're proteins that allow water to cross the plasma membrane easily. And so the more aquaporins you have in the plasma membrane, the more water can pass through. And so negative feedback loop kicks in, and the hypothalamus says, oh, okay, we need to increase the amount of water that is in the tissues of the body and the blood of the body. So we need to increase that fluid retention. And therefore it sends signals that say, manufacture more of those aquaporins in the plasma membrane of the kidney tubules. And so that's what it will do. So how does the hypothalamus know? Like, it's the boss, but it's not psychic. How does it know whether it needs more aquaporins or not in these kidney tubule cells? Well, it's going to be sensitive to osmoreceptors that are existing in the hypothalamus. And so these are proteins that are constantly testing the water, or testing the environment, how much water is there. Is it low? Is it high? And if it's low, it's going to manufacture ADH to tell those kidney tubules to make more aquaporins to allow more water to leave the kidney tubules and go to the body. So it's constantly using its osmoreceptors to measure the ion concentration of the blood. Because you remember with diffusion and osmosis, if ion concentration is high, then the reverse is true, that the water is low. And so it's constantly measuring the ion concentration so it can determine whether the water is high, low, or where it needs to be. So there are disorders where people are not able to produce enough ADH in the hypothalamus when it's needed. And in this case, it causes disease. So the inability or lack of ability to produce ADH is a condition called diabetes insipidus. And so you can see this little graphic here, which will tell you about the difference, for example, in urine between someone who's normal and can produce enough ADH compared to someone who does not have the ability to produce ADH, and therefore the kidneys are going to produce a lot of urine because they're not getting that signal to reabsorb the water. All right, so I hope that makes sense. And next, we're going to talk about oxytocin. So you just learned about ADH from the hypothalamus, which helps to retain water in the body. The next hormone from the hypothalamus we're going to talk about is oxytocin. And as a mother, I love oxytocin. So oxytocin is produced by the hypothalamus, released into the posterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary is the one that actually releases it to the body. So the oxytocin has a couple different functions in the body, and they in some way relate to reproduction and nursing the baby. So number one, oxytocin is responsible for the letdown reflex of milk. So a nursing mother after she has a baby will start producing oxytocin, which targets the cells of the mammary glands. And so that tells those cells of the mammary glands to contract so that milk can be injected. So oxytocin is not the hormone that makes the milk or even tells the mammary glands to make milk, but it tells those mammary glands to release the milk, to eject it. But it has to be triggered by a physical stimulus. And of course, the most obvious physical stimulus for getting oxytocin to be produced is the baby suckling during nursing. And so this becomes a positive feedback loop, one of the few positive feedback loops we talk about in this class. The baby suckles, and that will send a message to the hypothalamus gland saying, produce more oxytocin. And then oxytocin will send the signal to the mammary glands to contract, to eject the milk, which causes the baby to nurse more, right? To suckle more to get up that milk, which causes the hypothalamus to produce more oxytocin, which ejects the milk and causes the baby to suckle more. And so that keeps going until the baby latches off. So that stoppage of the suckling stops the positive feedback loop and turns it into a negative feedback loop. Now, of course, the same response would happen if it was an artificial baby, like a milk pump. But either way, the idea is that the cells have to be stimulated in order for the signal to go back to the hypothalamus to release more oxytocin. Now, when a mother stops nursing altogether, there's no more suckling response or a breast pump creating a suckling response. then we're in permanent negative feedback loop mode and no more oxytocin is produced and the mother will eventually not be able to produce any more milk. Now, oxytocin also is responsible for smooth muscle contraction for uterine contractions. So during childbirth, those uterine contractions, labor pains, is also a positive feedback loop. So the more contraction that happens, the more the hypothalamus will produce oxytocin, and that will keep happening and happening more and happening more until the baby's born. Once the baby's out, that cuts off the positive feedback loop, converts it into negative feedback loop, and the contractions will stop. This is also an area of current research. We know that mothers and even fathers right away will create a bond. They'll have a bond with their baby. And a lot of research is showing that oxytocin might actually also be responsible, or at least partly responsible, for that feeling of bonding that happens between a parent and the offspring. So very interesting. All right, we are on our last stop on this hypothalamus train here. We're going to discuss the releasing and inhibiting hormones that will allow the hypothalamus to control it all. It'll say when to start and when to stop producing particular tropic hormones. So it's going to be targeting for most of these the anterior pituitary gland. Remember, that's also called the adenohypophysis. And in two cases, as we've talked about, it will be targeting neurological tissue in the posterior pituitary gland. And in all cases, ultimately, there are target organs that will receive these signals in order to release their hormones or elicit some other response. So let's go over these. The first one we are going to talk about is thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. Thyrotropin targeting releasing hormone, TRH. So if we look at this graphic, again, this thing's really great for just studying this stuff. You see the hypothalamus is producing TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. It's sending that signal to the anterior pituitary gland, the adenohypophysis, and telling it to produce and release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. We'll talk about in a minute, but it targets the thyroid gland to release its hormones. So it is telling the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, release that TSH hormone that will boss the thyroid gland and tell it what to release. Number two, corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. Cortico sounds like cortex. In fact, it's going to be ultimately targeting the adrenal cortex. So corticotropin releasing hormone. And as you can see here it is, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. And the hypothalamus is going to produce it. It's going to send that hormone into the anterior pituitary gland through that portal system and tell the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which we will be talking about in just a minute. That ultimately is going to target the cells of the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland that sits right on top of the kidney, and it's going to tell it to release its hormone. So we are going to talk about that when we get to the adrenal gland in just a minute. But the idea here is CRH is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that tells the anterior pituitary to release its hormone, ACTH, which tells the adrenal cortex to release its hormones. Number three, prolactin releasing hormone, PRH. Pretty much is what it sounds like. Prolactin means make milk. So it's going to tell the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormone, prolactin, that will ultimately result in the creation of milk. So PRH, here it is from the hypothalamus, tells the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, to release prolactin, targeting the mammary gland to make milk for the baby. Number four, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, gonadotropin. Gonado targets the gonads, tropin targets, right? Targeting the gonads. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's another one that's going to communicate with the anterior pituitary gland. So here it is, not to be confused with growth hormone releasing hormone. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone, secreted and produced by the hypothalamus, sent through the portal system to the anterior pituitary gland, tells it to release these gonadotropin hormones, which is FSH and LH. We will be talking about those in just a minute. And those target the gonads, so testes in a male or ovaries in a female. So speaking of the one that people confuse with gonadotropin releasing hormone, we have growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. GHRH. So GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, targets the anterior pituitary gland cells and tells them to release growth hormone, GH, and that pretty much targets all the cells of the body because all of our cells ultimately grow, right? Whether they're dividing as cells through cell division or in a child, longitudinal growth. Either way, there's growth going on. And so the boss, the hypothalamus, is going to release the growth hormone releasing hormone to tell the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone to cause all our cells to do their thing. Now, those are releasing hormones. So thyrotropin, corticotropin, prolactin, gonadotropin, growth hormone, all releasing hormones. But now we're going to talk a couple of inhibiting hormones. We have somatostatin, and you'll also see this pop up when we talk about the pancreas. Somatostatin inhibits TSH from the anterior pituitary. So this is the antagonist to TRH. This is going to say, okay, we have enough thyroid hormone coming out of these thyroids, so we need to slow that down. And so the hypothalamus will release somatostatin, will be sent to the anterior pituitary through the portal system, telling it to stop producing thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, to tell the thyroid to stop producing its thyroid hormones, which you'll learn later is T3 and T4. Then another inhibitory hormone from the hypothalamus is prolactin inhibiting factor, and it's also called dopamine, which you might have heard of. So dopamine or prolactin inhibiting factor is going to be the one that tells the anterior pituitary to stop producing prolactin, PRL, to stop producing milk, to tell the mammary glands to stop producing milk. So dopamine or prolactin inhibiting factor is the antagonist to prolactin releasing hormone. So you see this a lot with these things that are involved in negative feedback loops. One will say do this and one will say do the opposite of what that one said. And then just a reminder, ADH and oxytocin do not reach the anterior pituitary gland. Those are sent through electrical signals down axons to the posterior pituitary gland where they are stored and released. But the posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. So that therefore these hypothalamic hormones, ADH and oxytocin, via the posterior pituitary are going to act directly on the kidneys and the mammary glands respectively. So now that you know all about the hypothalamus, it's time to come on down that infundibulum and get to the anterior pituitary gland sitting in that sella turcica. So there are a lot of hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland, but there's 6 main tropic hormones that we're going to focus on for this lecture. Just keep in mind there are other things that are produced as well, but we'll save that for another day. So let's go over the first 3 on this slide. Number 1, we are going to talk about thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. It has another name, of course, like so many things in A&P. The other name is thyrotropin. And just as the name sounds, this hormone, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone or thyrotropin, is going to target the cells of the thyroid gland, which is located on the anterior neck right over the larynx. So it's targeting the cells of the thyroid gland, and it's going to tell those cells to grow. It's going to tell the whole gland to grow and to secrete thyroid hormones. And we'll be talking more about those the thyroid hormones later in this lecture, but just to give you a sneak preview, they're called T3 and T4. And so just recall that ultimately this thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to happen. It's going to get produced and released because the anterior pituitary received the signal from the hypothalamus in the form of TRH from the hypothalamus. This TSH will keep getting produced and secreted, targeting those thyroid cells until it receives a stop signal. And remember that that is going to be an inhibiting hormone called somatostatin from the hypothalamus. Somato refers to body. Statin means stop. So this is going to be a stopping hormone, an inhibitory hormone that will say, close that negative feedback loop, stop producing TSH, anterior pituitary gland, and that will stop that hormone from targeting the thyroid cells and telling them to release their thyroid hormones. It'll stop the production of thyroid hormones. Secondly, the anterior pituitary is going to produce a hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Adrenocortico, so you know it's going to target the adrenal cortices. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, also called corticotropin. So these are targeting the cells of the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex is the outer part of the adrenal glands, which are found right on top of the kidneys. And basically, ACTH is going to tell the adrenal cortex cells to produce and release adrenal steroid hormones, specifically cortisol, which is like the stress hormone. And to an extent, also will tell it to release aldosterone, which is another hormone produced by the adrenal cortex. So ACTH is telling the adrenal cortex to release cortisol and, to a lesser extent, aldosterone. And just remember that all of this is stimulated by a hormone produced by the hypothalamus, which is CRH. So recall that CRH tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which tells the cells of the adrenal cortex to release their hormones, especially cortisol. And finally, let's go over a third hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. This is LH, or luteinizing hormone. It is a gonadotropin because it's going to target the gonads, testes in the male or ovaries in the female. If there's testes, if it's a male, it's going to say to the testes, produce the androgen testosterone. And if it's a female, it's going to tell the cells of the ovaries to produce the female hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And we'll be talking more about those hormones in a little bit. But if it's ovaries, it's going to tell it to produce estrogen and progesterone, which is going to stimulate ovulation as well as help with the development of the follicle. And if there's a pregnancy, the maintenance of pregnancy. So those two hormones together. So anyway, luteinizing hormone is one of the gonadotropins that is released by the anterior pituitary, and it releases it because it got a signal from the hypothalamus in the form of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So that's the first three of 6, TSH, ACTH, and LH. All are tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. And be sure to check out this graphic right here, as well as this one, which will help you to learn which cells of which organs are being targeted, what the hormones are from the anterior pituitary, and reminding you that they were released because they got a signal from the hypothalamus. So thus far, you've learned 3 of those 6 anterior pituitary hormones that we're going to be going over. And the third one you just learned about was luteinizing hormone, LH, which is a gonadotropin that targets the testes or the ovaries to produce their hormones. Well, we're going to go over number 4 now, and this is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. And it too is a gonadotropin, and in fact is kind of like the partner of LH. They tend to work together as a team. Now, just like LH, FSH is stimulated by a hormone from the hypothalamus, and that is the same one, gonadotropin releasing hormone. And it has a slightly different function than LH, especially in the testes. So in the testes, whereas LH told the testes to produce testosterone, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is going to tell the testes to concentrate that testosterone. So concentrate it together. And the way it does that is by inducing the testosterone to bind to certain chemical elements in the testes, and that concentrates it in solution. Now, along with LH in the ovaries, follicle stimulating hormone is going to help with the production of estrogen. But in addition, follicle stimulating hormone is going to do what the name kind of implies, and that is maturing the actual follicles of the ovaries, which are going to help with the development of the oocytes of the egg. So FSH, LH, great team together. Now, number 5 on our list is prolactin, PRL. And of course, as the name entails, prolactin promotes the production of milk. And specifically, it's going to do that by targeting the lactotroph cells of the mammary glands. So the mammary glands are the primary target of prolactin, and it is all about milk production. So it gets those mammary glands to produce milk. And as we said before, the letdown of the milk comes from signals from oxytocin produced by the hypothalamus. And so oxytocin and prolactin together are how the baby can drink the milk. And it's the baby suckling that actually continues that positive feedback loop. And it's only when the baby stops suckling that that positive feedback loop converts to a negative feedback loop, and there's no more lactation at that point. Now, what's going to actually cut off that positive feedback loop when the baby stops suckling is feedback to the hypothalamus to get it to release prolactin inhibiting factor, or also known as dopamine, that we discussed earlier, and that will tell the anterior pituitary to stop producing that PRL, that prolactin. Okay, so 5 out of 6 anterior pituitary hormones we've done so far. We've gone over FSH, LH, prolactin, ACTH, and TSH. That leaves one more of the 6 that we're talking about, and that is growth hormone, which is quite involved and gets a whole slide by itself. So let's talk about hormone number 6 from the anterior pituitary, and that is growth hormone, or GH. And it gets a whole slide by itself because it does a whole lot of things. So overall, growth hormone is going to do exactly what it sounds like it's going to do. It's going to regulate and control growth. And it's therefore going to target most of the cells of the body. So bone, liver, fat tissue, heart tissue, skeletal muscle, cartilage, you name it, it's targeting that. And it's going to target it for growth in terms of the whole tissue as well as cell division. Now, growth hormone is going to have both short and long-term effects. So short-term effects are highly metabolic in nature. In general, it's going to make sure that there is fuel available in the blood for growth and repair. And that fuel is going to come in the form of like glucose and fatty acids. And all of that's going to promote growth because it'll allow fuel to be available for those cells to use to make ATP and to grow. So how's it going to do this? Short term, it's going to promote increased lipolysis. That means breakdown of fat in these adipose sites. Gluconeogenesis, targeting that in the liver. So gluco means sugar, neo, new, genesis, generate. So generating new glucose molecules in the blood. And inhibition of glucose uptake by muscle cells. So in other words, if you want fuel to be available for growth, you need to make sure that you have a high enough blood glucose concentration, which means you don't want the other cells taking it up, removing it from the blood. You want to keep that concentration pretty high. But that's all short term. Now, long-term effects of growth hormone can actually almost have the opposite effects in a sense. Now, they also are acting, so long-term effects are also going to happen in most of the cells of the body, particularly the liver. And in the long term, this growth hormone is going to stimulate the production of another hormone or another protein called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. Insulin-like growth factor. And as we'll talk about soon, insulin as a hormone is involved in maintenance of blood glucose levels. But this is not insulin, but it acts kind of like insulin. And so hence it's called insulin-like growth factor. Now, that insulin-like growth factor can be reduced by an antagonist, and that is somatostatin, which is, we've already talked about, is released by the hypothalamus. So when somatostatin is released by the hypothalamus, that will say, okay, cool the production of IGF. So long-term effects of growth hormone, promotion of protein synthesis, so the synthesis of proteins, and cell division, which essentially is growth of cells, right? It's where how cells reproduce you've learned through mitosis, they just divide and boom, now you have 2 cells. This is in turn going to promote long bone growth in children as well as muscle development in children. And here's where it has kind of the opposite effects of short-term effects of growth hormone. And that is that it's going to actually, in the long term, lower blood glucose concentrations by encouraging cells to take up that glucose from the blood. So just remember, short term, it's kind of decreasing the amount of glucose taken up by the tissues, but in the long term, it increases that. And so you get overall increase in body mass as a result of these long-term effects of growth hormone. Now, when things don't go right, there are obviously going to be effects on the body. So if too much growth hormone is secreted, and this could happen, for example, from a tumor in the anterior pituitary gland, you can end up with a condition called acromegaly or gigantism. And so you may have seen the movie The Princess Bride or something else where Andre the Giant was a character in there, was an actor. He actually had acromegaly and ended up dying from the effects of it. You can see that acromegaly just basically increases body mass all around and including increasing mass of vital organs like the heart, which is why they end up having heart problems. So here's a couple examples of the effects of acromegaly. The opposite of that is where there's hyposecretion. There's not enough growth hormone secreted. Again, it could be from a tumor or something else, but this can lead to dwarfism, like this child right here is a dwarf. So they're not getting normal growth. So, our bodies are always in tune to having the proper levels of hormone whenever things are running normally. And so there's a set point. If it's too high, then we'll decrease growth hormone. If it's too low, we'll increase growth hormone. So we are done with the anterior pituitary gland for a while. Let's move on to another endocrine organ. And this time we're going to talk about the thyroid gland. And as we mentioned before, the thyroid gland is found in the anterior neck, right by the trachea, right over the larynx. And so you can see up here is the Adam's apple with the thyroid cartilage. And here's your thyroid glands, kind of butterfly shaped. Here it is again from another view. And in terms of its general anatomy, it has lobes. So each wing of the butterfly is a lobe. So we have the right and left lobes, and those lobes are connected by an isthmus. So if you think of the Isthmus of Panama, isthmus just means like a bridge or like some kind of little land bridge. This is the bridge. This isthmus is the bridge between the lobes. Now let's talk about the histology of the thyroid, and it's unmistakable. It's really interesting. So here's a micrograph here of a cross-section of a thyroid, and right off the bat, it's so easy to identify because you see these big like pools. These are called colloids, and they're a gelatinous material that's full of protein and full of iodine, and therefore it's going to be storing the precursors to the creation of thyroid hormone. So the colloids store protein and iodine as precursors to making thyroid hormone. Now, surrounding these colloids is a single layer, a simple cuboidal epithelium. So you remember those little cube-shaped cells that you learned before. So a simple cuboidal epithelium surrounding each colloid, and that is where the actual thyroid hormones are produced. So the precursors are stored in the colloid, but the hormones are produced in these follicle cells, these simple cuboidal follicle cells that surround the colloid. So when you take the follicle cells and the colloid together, what you have is what's known as a follicle in the thyroid gland. Now, all the stuff between those follicles, these are cells called parafollicular cells. Para means near, so they're near the follicles. And those are not going to produce thyroid hormone. They're going to produce another hormone called calcitonin, which we're going to be talking about in just a minute. So now you know the anatomy and histology of the thyroid. We're ready to start talking about the thyroid hormones. Now, in general, these thyroid hormones do a lot, and we can divide that into three main functions. Principally, metabolism. So thyroid hormones are really the metabolism hormone. They target most of the cells of the body and are going to help to do all the reactions that happen in the body, all those biochemical reactions that allow your body to do what your body does. And included in that, these thyroid hormones are going to help regulate the temperature of your body, thermoregulation. And that's really a byproduct of the fact that they're involved with metabolism, because heat is given off by a lot of these reactions that are part of our metabolism. Also, thyroid hormone plays a role in coordinating the endocrine system with the nervous system and with growth and development. So let's take a little bit of a look at this. We mentioned before, the hypothalamus, the boss gland, is going to control negative feedback loops in the body where hormones are concerned. And in terms of thyroid hormone, the way it's going to do this is by releasing thyrotropin releasing hormones. So we mentioned that. We said TRH is going to ultimately communicate with the anterior pituitary gland and tell the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And that is going to target the cells of the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. And there are two types of thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. And we'll talk a little bit more about these in a second. Now, there's that other hormone we mentioned also produced by the thyroid gland, and that's calcitonin. That is produced by the parafollicular cells, whereas T3 and T4 are produced by the follicular cells. So we're not going to talk about calcitonin on this slide. We'll mention it in a little bit. Now, T3 and T4 are the thyroid hormones, and they are involved in negative feedback loops. So the body knows, if all goes well, how much T3 and T4 are needed, and if the levels go above that set point, things will kick in, the hypothalamus will kick in, and that will bring those levels back to the set point. If it goes higher than that, hypothalamus will kick in, and it'll come back to the set point. Now, again, thyroid hormone is going to target most cells, just like growth hormone did. Now, thyroid hormones are hydrophobic. So this is really interesting. If you listen to part 1 of our endocrine lecture, you learn that you can take hormones and divide them into 2 main categories, amino acid-based hormones and steroid hormones. Now, most of the amino acid-based hormones are hydrophilic, but thyroid hormone is one of the exceptions. It is hydrophobic. And why that's important? Because it's going to determine how this hormone reacts with target cells. So for hydrophilic hormones, recall that they have to bind to a protein receptor embedded in the plasma membrane of the target cell. But hydrophobic hormones don't need a plasma membrane receptor. They go straight through that plasma membrane and they meet up with protein receptors inside of the cell. And so thyroid hormone is hydrophobic, so it's just going to go straight through the plasma membrane. It's not going to dock on any plasma receptors. Now, the other thing thyroid hormones do is they set our body's basal metabolic rate. So in other words, thyroid hormones are responsible for determining like the amount of energy that's needed to carry out the body's reactions. And this includes both catabolic and anabolic reactions. Recall catabolic, my cat tears up my furniture into pieces. Catabolic reactions are where you have a large molecule and they're going to get broken into smaller molecules. Anabolic is the opposite. Anna builds a house. And so you're going to take small molecules and build them into something bigger. And so the thyroid hormones play a role in both of those. So for example, thyroid hormone can increase gluconeogenesis, which raises the amount of glucose available in blood. It increases the amount of lipolysis going on. So that would be breakdown of fat from the adipocytes, and that makes fatty acids available in the blood. And protein breakdown. Breaking down proteins makes amino acids available in the blood. And so thyroid hormones are helping, just like growth hormone did, to make sure there's enough fuel in the blood to carry out the body's metabolic reactions. So it increases the amount of fatty acids, amino acids, and glucose available in the blood. But it also does the opposite. It's going to help to create bigger things by helping to take those amino acids and put them together to make proteins, and to take those fatty acids and put them together to make fats. Additionally, thyroid hormones are going to, when needed, help in getting neurotransmitters through to other cells. And they're going to do this by increasing the amount of receptors available to bind to sympathetic neurotransmitters, things like acetylcholine. And so thyroid hormones are playing a role in the upregulation in order to produce more receptors to bind to sympathetic neurotransmitters. And finally, and related to all this, these thyroid hormones are going to play a role in the body's regulation of blood pressure, regulation of heart rate, and some of these other things that happen in our body that are so important for our homeostasis. So now you have a good background on the thyroid hormones. Let's take a closer look at the actual hormones themselves, and then we're going to talk about how those thyroid hormones are actually synthesized. So the two thyroid hormones are T3 and T4. T3 stands for Triiodothyronine, and it has 3 iodine atoms on it, and you can see that over here. So here's the actual chemical composition of T3, and you can see 1, 2, 3 iodine atoms on it. T4, similar, except 1, 2, 3, 4 iodine atoms, and T4 is also called thyroxine. So T3, Triiodothyronine, T4, thyroxine. Or you can just say T3 and T4. It's a lot easier. The third hormone that the thyroid gland produces, but is not really endocrine in nature, is calcitonin. So what calcitonin does, and you may remember this if you've studied the skeletal system, is it's going to decrease the calcium levels in the blood in response to hypercalcemia. So if you have really high calcium concentration in the blood, that calcium concentration needs to decrease. You don't want too much of it. And so calcitonin gets released. And what that's actually going to do is kind of put the brakes on the osteoclasts. So remember that osteoclasts break down bone. And when bone gets broken down, calcium is going to be deposited into the blood, and that's going to raise the blood calcium levels. So if calcium levels are too high, calcitonin is going to say to the osteoblasts, and therefore deliver the message to the osteoclasts, whoa, stop breaking down bone. We don't need any more calcium put into the blood. And so that's ultimately going to lead to the calcium being taken up and used to build bone. So that's calcitonin. But when we're talking about endocrine, we're talking about thyroid hormones. We're talking about T3 and T4. And it's important that the body have that homeostasis, that set point for the amount of T3, especially in the blood, because too much thyroid hormone can lead to something called hyperthyroid disease or hyperthyroidism. And too little thyroid hormone can cause hypothyroidism. And in both cases, they come with a whole set of really bad side effects, really bad symptoms. So you can see, for example, someone who has hyperthyroidism can get bulging eyes. They can have heart palpitations. They have severe weight loss, things like that. Hypothyroidism, they can become very fatigued and weak. They can get constipation, weight gain, all this kind of stuff. It's kind of common. And it's more common in females than it is males. So a woman is about 5 times more likely to have thyroid disorders than a male. Good thing is a lot of this can be controlled with medications. In some cases, people have to get their thyroids removed and then take medications. But it is more common in females than it is males. So now let's talk about how these thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, are actually synthesized. And it's a little complicated, but we're going to try to break it down and make it make sense. So you know the thyroid hormones are T3 and T4, and you know that iodine is involved with those. So T3 has 3 iodines on it, and T4 has 4, as we mentioned before. Now, to create T3 and T4, the first thing that we have to do is get the iodine in the correct format. So when you take in iodine from your diet, maybe it's through your iodized salt, it's going to be in the form of what we call iodide, which is I with a negative there, so it has an extra electron, right? So we have to convert that iodide into elemental iodine. And so that's going to happen in the colloid of of the thyroid gland. So you remember those colloids, the gelatinous stuff. So that iodide is going to be converted into IO, which is elemental iodine, in the colloid. But we're not done yet, because we have to actually be able to combine that iodine now with a protein called thyroglobulin in order for us to get to where we need to get that thyroid hormone created. So thyroglobulin is a big old protein. And so we're going to take that protein. It has a lot of tyrosine amino acids, if you remember that from your amino acid table. So that iodine, elemental iodine that we just created in the colloid, is going to combine with thyroglobulin protein inside the colloid. And now we got a complex, right? We got a complex that is iodine plus protein plus thyroglobulin. So we can call that I-thyroglobulin or iodinated thyroglobulin. So it's a complex, right? And so it's in the colloid, but now we have to move it back onto that simple cuboidal layer of follicle cells. So we're going to take that iodinated thyroglobulin complex, move it back from the colloid into those follicle cells. And once they're in those follicle cells, they're going to meet up with the follicle cells' lysozymes. And if you remember, lysozymes are little organelles, little bubbles that contain digestive enzymes. And so once they are taken up by those lysozymes, they're going to meet enzymes that will then go and take those iodines off of the protein, off that thyroglobulin that we just put on in the colloid. Now we got to take them back off. So now we're going to take those iodine atoms off that protein, and they're going to come off in two different ways. So we're going to get some that are going to come off as monoiodothyronine, or MIT. In other words, there's one iodine along with this compound called threonine, and some of them are going to come off as diiodothyronine, or DIT, where there's two iodines connected to the threonine. And we're still not done yet. So this is all happening in the follicle cells. Now we, in some cases, will take MIT and add it to DIT. So we're getting one iodine and two iodines added together. Well, 1 + 2 is 3. So this is where we get our triiodothyronine, or T3 hormone. So that's one of the thyroid hormones. So that's one scenario that can happen. The other scenario that can happen is right from the get-go, you're just producing DIT. And so DIT plus DIT, that means 2 iodines plus 2 more iodines, and they're both attached to threonine. 2 + 2 is 4. So now we get T4. So the thyroxine, that's the one that has 4 iodines on it. And in fact, this latter route will happen about 90% of the time. Some books say 80, some say 90, but the vast majority of thyroid hormone that's going to be produced is DIT plus DIT, so T4. Only about 10% or so is going to be T3. Once we get our T4 and our T3 getting produced in these follicle cells, they're now going to go ahead and move on to the bloodstream. Now, only T3 is the biologically active form of thyroid hormone. So to do all those metabolic reactions and all those other things we talked about, we have to have T3. Yet we said only about 10% of the hormone that's produced is T3, most is T4. But that's okay, because we can convert T4 to T3, just pulling off an iodine. So why do we produce so much T4 when what we need is T3, yet we don't produce much of it? Well, good question. Well, our body doesn't like to waste stuff. And it turns out that the half-life, how much time half of the amount of substance is going to be around, the half-life is much longer for T4 than T3. So T3 will degrade in 24 hours, whereas T4 can be around for a 7-day half-life. And so it's kind of almost a way of storing what you need to be able to do those metabolic reactions. Go ahead and store it in T4. Like, it's almost like storing it in the pantry to use later. And so we can that way have a high concentration of T4 in the blood, ready to be converted to T3 when we need it. Wow. So thyroid hormone, kind of a big one to understand. Growth hormone, kind of a big one to understand. So let's tone it down a little bit and talk about parathyroid hormone, which is a little bit easier to understand. So parathyroid glands are found in the posterior side of the thyroid gland, but they themselves are a separate endocrine organ. And depending on the person, you might have 3 to 5 of these little glands sitting on the posterior side of your thyroid. Most people have 4. And the parathyroid glands really only do one major thing. They are going to produce parathyroid hormone, or PTH. And parathyroid hormone is produced by the chief cells of the parathyroid glands, and it really has one major function. PTH increases calcium levels in the blood and the extracellular fluid. So in that sense, PTH is the antagonist to the calcitonin we mentioned was produced in the thyroid gland. So whereas calcitonin was responding to hypercalcemia, where the calcium levels are too high in the blood, parathyroid hormone is going to do the opposite. It's going to respond to hypocalcemia, where the calcium levels are too low in the blood. And so it can try to raise the calcium levels in the blood several ways. One way is by doing the opposite of what the thyroid hormone did, and that is to make sure that the osteoblasts change so that the osteoclasts do their thing, and that is to break down bone. So remember that the calcitonin from the thyroid gland would shut the osteoclasts down so that the calcium levels would decrease in the blood and be used to build bone. Well, PTH is going to do the opposite. It's going to stimulate those osteoclasts to break the bone down and thus release the calcium back into the blood, thereby raising the calcium level in the blood. Now, also, parathyroid hormone acts on kidneys. It acts on the cells of the kidneys to convert inactive vitamin D to active vitamin D, called vitamin D3, also called calcitrol. Now, you can buy vitamin D3 in any grocery store. So you probably already know that when you go outside and you're exposed to ultraviolet radiation from the sun, your skin will manufacture vitamin D. You hear it all the time. However, that vitamin D is an inactive form. It's not going to help the body without being converted. So it has to get converted to calcitrol, or vitamin D3. And we can thank our parathyroid hormones for doing that for us. One of the things parathyroid hormone does is it actually acts on the small intestine to increase the absorption of dietary calcium. So in other words, what you're eating has calcium, but without parathyroid hormone, that calcium would be inefficient at getting absorbed by the small intestines and therefore wouldn't help your body as much as we need it. So parathyroid hormone is going to increase the absorption of dietary calcium in the small intestines. And finally, it's going to act on the cells of the kidney tubules to reabsorb calcium. So your kidneys are going to be processing things. Some things are going to get excreted as urine, and other things are going to get reabsorbed by the body. And one of those things that's going to get reabsorbed is calcium, thanks to the action of parathyroid hormone. So now we're ready to start in on the adrenal glands. And recall that the adrenal glands are these little pyramid-shaped glands that sit right on top of the kidneys, the superior side of the kidneys. And really, when you're saying adrenal glands, it's like 2 endocrine organs in one. So we have the adrenal cortex on the outside, which is going to release several series of chemicals, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and androgens. And then on the very middle of the adrenal glands, we have the adrenal medulla, which is going to secrete its own things, catecholamines and peptides. So we're going to talk about the adrenal medulla in a little bit. Right now, let's focus on the adrenal cortex and what it produces. Now, the adrenal cortex is a tropic endocrine gland, so it's going to be releasing hormones that are going to target other tissues. And it's part of what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, or HPA. That's a mouthful. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. Easy way to really understand that is just look at this little picture here, and you can see hypothalamus. Recall that it secretes the releasing hormone CRH that tells the anterior pituitary to release its hormone, ACTH, and that targets the cells of the adrenal cortex to release its hormones, for example, cortisol. So we'll be talking about cortisol in a little bit. But anyway, through this HPA axis, we are actually going to be able to regulate the negative feedback loop that the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal cortex are involved in. So overall, the adrenal cortex is going to produce steroid hormones, and they're going to produce them through chief cells. Now, these steroids are really interesting because they are derived from the compound cholesterol, which everybody's heard of cholesterol. It's a four-ringed structure. And so all these steroid hormones are built off of cholesterol. Now, if you look at the histology of the adrenal cortex under very low power, you're going to see something like this. Now, keep in mind if you're in the laboratory and you're looking, depending on how the slide was prepared, some are going to very clearly show these different zones, whereas others, the stain is too dark and too uniform, it'll be a lot harder to make out. But if you get a good stain, a good slide, you're going to notice 3 different zones of cells. And those are going to sit, that makes up the cortex, and then right in the middle here is the adrenal medulla. So let's talk about these zones a little bit. So right next to the adrenal medulla, we have the Zona reticularis, and you can see how those cells are very tightly packed in there. Moving on out, we have the Zona fasciculata, and you can see those cells are kind of stacked on top of each other. They're more loose. And we can see the Zona glomerulosa up here. And then finally, the whole adrenal gland is covered with a capsule. So kind of with the Zona reticularis, remember that reticular refers to a kind of a network. So they're kind of just like kind of packed in there like packing peanuts. And then a fasciculata and glomerulosa. Now, each of these zones, the cells of each of these zones produce different things. So the Zona glomerulosa is going to produce the mineralocorticoids that we're going to be talking about. The Zona fasciculata is going to produce the glucocorticoids, and the Zona reticularis is going to produce glucocorticoids as well as the androgenic steroids. So we're going to talk about each of these kinds of hormones that the adrenal cortex is going to produce. So now that you understand the basic structure of the adrenal cortex and the general categories of hormones it produces, let's take a closer look at mineralocorticoids produced from the adrenal cortex. So mineralocorticoids are a group of steroid hormones that regulate mineral concentration in the body. And by regulating mineral concentration, they're going to play a crucial role in regulating fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance in the body. And we'll be talking about these concepts a lot deeper later on in anatomy and physiology. But for now, let's focus on the chief mineralocorticoid, and that is aldosterone. So aldosterone is a steroid hormone, hydrophobic, derived from cholesterol, and it is the main mineralocorticoid. What's going to trigger the release of aldosterone is high levels of potassium in the blood, low blood pH, and high levels of a compound called angiotensin II. Now, we'll be talking a lot more about angiotensin II later on when we, for example, study the urinary system. But for now, know that aldosterone is part of something called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS. So we'll be talking a lot more about RAS later on. But for now, just understand that it is critical to the maintenance of blood pressure homeostasis in the body. And so because aldosterone is part of that RAS system, it's going to also play a role in blood pressure. And in fact, it acts to increase blood pressure in the body. Increase blood pressure in the body. Now, how is it going to do that? Well, one of the things it does is it increases the body fluid and overall blood volume. So the more fluid you have retained in your body, the more blood that's going through your blood vessels, the greater the blood pressure. So imagine your blood vessels are, only so big. The tube is only so big. And when you have a lot of fluid going through there, a lot of blood, which is mostly water, it's going to put pressure on the walls of those blood vessels. And so that's increased blood pressure. And why does this happen? How does it increase the fluid, the blood volume in the body? Well, it's going to increase and then we're talking about aldosterone here. Aldosterone is going to increase the number of sodium potassium pumps and sodium channels and sodium chloride potassium co-transporters that exist. And so the more of these proteins that you have embedded in the plasma membrane, the more these minerals can flow into the body tissues. So more sodium coming out in there, more chloride coming in there. Well, you know from your understanding of diffusion and osmosis that when you increase the concentration of a solute like sodium, the next thing that's going to happen is osmosis is going to make water want to go into the area where the sodium is to kind of, dilute it, balance it out, because water wants to go from an area where it has greater concentration of water to an area where it has less concentration of water. Well, in a solution where there's high concentration of a solute like sodium, by default, that means there's low concentration of water. So the water is going to eventually follow the sodium. Sodium is then going to want to go through diffusion from where it's more concentrated to lesser. So it's going to go the opposite way. And so you end up having a greater concentration of water, in this case, in the body tissues. So you're increasing your overall blood volume in the body, thereby increasing blood pressure. Well, the opposite is true when it comes to potassium. So it was high potassium levels in the blood that helped to trigger the release of aldosterone. But because aldosterone is now triggered and the sodium moves in and then it's followed by the water stays, the sodium moves back. Well, potassium tends to move in opposite directions from sodium. So if the sodium is now entering the body tissues ahead of the water because of the aldosterone, the potassium is going to go the opposite way. So aldosterone is getting sodium to be reabsorbed into the body, which it then will be accompanied by the water going into the body. Potassium is going to move back into the kidneys, and therefore it will be secreted into the urine. So overall, aldosterone is increasing water in the body and increasing the output of potassium into the urine. So overall, aldosterone is increasing sodium into the tissues, indirectly increasing water into the tissues through reabsorption from the kidneys, and therefore increasing the secretion of potassium ions into the urine. Now, kind of like, how water likes to eventually follow the sodium and the potassium likes to go the opposite from the sodium, well, hydrogen ions like to kind of follow the potassium. So aldosterone plays a critical role in acid-base balance, and it's going to do this by activating hydrogen ion or proton pumps in the cells of the kidney tubules. And so by activating these proton pumps, we're going to get increased secretion of protons, hydrogen ions, into the urine. And in the process, hydrogen ions contribute to a more acidic solution, right? So remember, when we're talking about pH, the definition of an acid is something that gives off hydrogen ions into solution. And so when you're losing hydrogen ions into the urine, you're secreting more hydrogen ions into the urine, that is going to lower the acid concentration in the blood. So essentially, it's kind of combating any acidity that's occurring in the blood so that our pH stays slightly alkaline at about 7.4. So again, just to recap, because I know that's a lot, aldosterone is secreted in response to high levels of potassium in the blood, low pH in the blood, and more of this angiotensin 2. And so this is going to cause, the aldosterone is going to cause sodium ion to be reabsorbed from the kidneys into the body. And indirectly, that causes more water retention, reabsorption into the body from the kidneys, thereby increasing blood volume and increasing blood pressure. And in response, potassium is going to leave the blood, go into the kidneys, and be secreted in the urine. And in addition, that aldosterone is going to increase the activity of proton pumps, therefore hydrogen ions, which were causing the blood to be slightly acidic, they're going to leave in the urine, and that is going to raise the pH of the blood so that we can maintain a slightly alkaline pH at about 7.4. So now we get to talk about glucocorticoids. You've talked about mineralocorticoids, with aldosterone being the principal one. We're now going to focus on cortisol, which is the principal glucocorticoid released by the adrenal cortex. And just like with the mineralocorticoids, what's going to trigger this ultimately is ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which was triggered by CRH from the hypothalamus. Now, cortisol is part of this fight or flight response. It's the stress hormone. It's going to help prepare the body to make sure that everything is there and ready for when a lion's chasing you, or you're studying for a test or doing exercise. So it's part of the stress response. It's going to help to regulate blood glucose levels, and it's going to target cells in the liver, the muscles, fat cells. So how is it going to do this? Well, just like we talked about with growth hormone, with thyroid hormone, very much cortisol is going to help ensure that there's enough glucose in the blood via gluconeogenesis so that when that lion's chasing you or you're studying for your test, you have fuel in the blood to do what you need to do. And so the way that cortisol is going to do this is, being a steroid hormone, it's going to pass through the plasma membranes of these hepatocytes, these liver cells, and eventually meet up with receptors inside the cell that are going to form that little complex we talked about and be able to bind to certain parts of the DNA of the hepatocyte. That's going to activate gene synthesis of certain enzymes, and it's those enzymes that are going to catalyze amino acids and fats to turn into glucose. So it's all about producing glucose, fuel, to be in the blood, and it's going to do it by activating genes in the DNA of liver cells that are going to cause the production of enzymes that are going to catalyze the creation of glucose from amino acids and fats. Now, the other thing this cortisol is going to do is tell muscle to break down to release amino acids into the blood. So by releasing these amino acids into the blood, by breaking down skeletal muscle protein, remember proteins are made of amino acids, it's going to ensure that there's amino acids in the blood ready to be used to help create glucose, right? So more gluconeogenesis. And finally, and related, it's this cortisol is also going to target adipocytes, fat cells, to do lipolysis, where they're going to break down so that fatty acids are released back into the blood. And that will aid in, guess what? Gluconeogenesis. So really what cortisol is doing is it's helping to make sure that there's a steady supply of ingredients that the liver can then use to create glucose through gluconeogenesis. Okay, so we're going to synthesize glucose by the hormone complex binding to the DNA. We're going to help the liver cells create glucose by releasing amino acids from muscle, and we're going to help the liver cells create glucose by releasing fatty acids from fat cells. Now, another interesting property of cortisol is that it is an anti-inflammatory hormone. It actually will help to suppress the inflammatory response in the body. And it does this by lowering the production of leukocytes, or the availability of leukocytes. And so because of this property that cortisol helps to kind of calm the system down, helps to suppress that inflammatory response, it's widely used in the medical industry as an anti-inflammatory medication. So if you study this little chart over here, it's really great for understanding kind of the short-term responses of cortisol in its role as in the stress response, and also long-term stress response. So anyway, very interesting hormone indeed. Cortisol, the stress hormone. Now, finally, we're on to that third category of steroid hormones that's produced by the adrenal cortex, and that is the androgenic steroids. So just like the other ones, it's ultimately going to be, these androgens are going to be formed from cholesterol. And for those of you really into biochemistry, you can look at all the fun pathways that happens. So here's cholesterol, here's testosterone, just so you can see how similar they are. But anyway, these steroids, the androgenic steroids, are released in small amounts from the adrenal cortex as byproducts of cortisol synthesis. And from there, those products can be converted in the blood to testosterone or estrogen. So it's kind of interesting. Both females and males produce both testosterone and estrogen from the adrenal cortices. It's just that, females don't have as many receptors to the testosterone and males don't have as many receptors to the estrogen. And of course, the total amounts are different because of the gonads. But it's just kind of interesting that both males and females produce androgenic steroids. So now that we've gone over the hormones of the adrenal cortex, and as we said, those are steroid hormones, therefore sort of long-term stress responses. Now let's dive inside the adrenal glands and look at the adrenal medulla hormones, or medulla, however you prefer to say it. I like medulla. So one of the differences between the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex is that the adrenal medulla is consisting of nervous tissue as opposed to endocrine tissue of the cortex. So it's a neuroendocrine organ, and what's going to trigger its release of its hormones is signals from the sympathetic nervous system, ACTH produced by the anterior pituitary gland, and enzymes that are released from the production of cortisol. And so this is going to trigger short-term stress responses in the adrenal medulla. In other words, what are known as fight or flight responses. Inside the medulla, the cells that are actually going to be producing these fight or flight chemicals are the chromaffin cells, and those are derived from nervous tissue. So fight or flight, the fight or flight response. In other words, lion is chasing you, what do? Or, something that all of us have experienced, what we call the adrenaline rush, right? And really what that is the release of these fight or flight hormones, epinephrine or norepinephrine. Now, together, norepinephrine and epinephrine are called catecholamines. So these are amino acid-based signals. They're hydrophilic, unlike what was produced from the adrenal cortex, which were steroid hormones, and they were hydrophobic. So these are hydrophilic catecholamines, and given that this is nervous tissue, they are going to be triggered or released acutely by the release of acetylcholine from presynaptic neurons. And if you think back when we talked about how neurons communicate with cells, you have the axon terminals, and you have some kind of neurotransmitter like acetylcholine inside these little vesicles. And when they get an electrical impulse, they are going to cause those vesicles to dump their contents out through exocytosis, which then those chemicals cross the synaptic cleft and bind to the next cell to elicit a response. So that's what's going on here, and it's the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And the response of the cells from receiving those acetylcholine signals is everything you'd expect to happen from a fight or flight response. And again, we've all experienced this. It could be like, oh no, you get handed a final exam, your heart starts beating, your pupils are going to dilate to let in more light. Let's imagine you are being chased by a tiger at night. You're going to want to get as much light in as possible so that you can run away from this tiger. So your pupils are going to dilate. Your heart's going to start beating faster to get that blood flowing, get oxygen to your cells so that you can make energy, ATP. Your bronchioles in your upper respiratory system are going to dilate. That's going to allow you to take in more air and therefore more oxygen to feed those cells to make that energy so you can run away from that lion. Your blood vessels are going to constrict, and that's going to increase your blood pressure. And this is going to happen through all sorts of organs in your body, including the skin, digestive organs, urinary organs. Because we're in fight or flight, that means we're suppressing rest and digest. So we're going to not be digesting food when we're trying to run from the tiger. We're not going to be producing much urine. So your digestive system and your urinary system are going to be slowed down, and the blood vessels in the skeletal muscles are going to actually have less constriction so that you can get more blood flowing to those muscles. So in other words, you're increasing blood vessel constriction in organs that are kind of more associated with rest and digest, but you're going to decrease the constriction in your skeletal muscles. So your body is basically devoting its energy, devoting its blood, devoting its oxygen to the skeletal muscles so you can run from that lion or tiger, or whatever it is you're talking about. So all of these fight or flight responses are going to be done because of the release of these catecholamines, norepinephrine and epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. This little picture here is going to be kind of just a quick summary to remind you that when you're talking about long-term stress, you're talking about those steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. And when you're talking about short-term stress, get away from that line as fast as you can. You're talking about these catecholamines released from the adrenal medulla. This table right here, great one to study from because it gives you a nice comparison between what goes on with the adrenal medulla versus the adrenal cortex. So even though these are both the adrenal gland, they really are like separate organs almost because they do completely different things. So adrenal cortex, steroid hormones, adrenal medulla, these amino acid based catecholamines. Let's go down here. Adrenal cortex, recall, was producing aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens, all steroid hydrophobic hormones. Adrenal medulla, we're talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine, etc. So definitely, as you're studying, use that chart. I think it'll be helpful. So we are moving right along here. Let's now talk about the pancreas. And the pancreas is very cool because it has both an endocrine function and an exocrine function. And you're probably like, where even is my pancreas? So this is what the pancreas looks like. It's this weird club-shaped organ. It's like grainy, kind of like loby, this light-colored thing. And it's kind of found posterior to the stomach and a little bit inferior to it as well. And so it has a head, a middle or a body, and a tail and a neck. So anatomy is pretty simple to learn on the pancreas, actually. Now, we're going to focus since we're doing the endocrine system right now, we're going to focus on its endocrine functions. But let's go ahead and mention the exocrine functions as well. So endocrine means it's part of the endocrine system. And really, to really appreciate it, you really have to look at the histology of the pancreas. So here's your pancreas. Here's the histology of the pancreas under the microscope. And if you get a good slide where the staining is really good, you're going to see these beautiful little circles here, and they look like islands in an ocean, in this case of pink. So some books call these the islets of Langerhans. We're just going to call them pancreatic islets. There's a general push to kind of get away from naming things after people anymore or using names where there's people's names after them. So we're going to call these pancreatic islets, and these are the endocrine pancreas. This is what is going to actually produce the endocrine hormones. And these little pancreatic islets actually consist of 3 types of cells. So we're going to have alpha cells, and that's going to produce the hormone glucagon. Beta cells are going to produce the antagonist to glucagon, which is the hormone insulin. And there's actually another type of cell in there called gamma cells, and those secrete somatostatin. And you might recall we mentioned somatostatin earlier because it's also produced by the hypothalamus. And that is the hormone that says slow down, stop, right? It's an inhibitory hormone. So that same hormone is produced by both the hypothalamus and the gamma cells of the pancreatic islets in the endocrine pancreas. Now, just briefly talking about the exocrine part of the pancreas, that's basically all the cells around these pancreatic islets. So they're not technically part of the endocrine system. They are part of the digestive system because they're going to secrete digestive enzymes that are going to play a role in breaking down your food. And so those cells are called acinar cells or acini, and you can just see their nuclei all over the place here. And those cells just surround the pancreatic islets. Okay, so now let's go in and talk more specifically about these hormones produced by the endocrine pancreas. So we said there's glucagon and insulin are 2 of the main ones, and these guys are antagonists to each other. They're both involved in regulation of blood glucose levels. So let's first talk about glucagon. And really what glucagon is going to do is respond to a detection of declining blood glucose levels. So insulin is going to help get rid of glucose that's in the blood by encouraging uptake of glucose into the cells. Glucagon is going to do the opposite. It's going to encourage the production of glucose and its release into the bloodstream to raise that blood glucose level. So that's kind of how this glucagon negative feedback loop works, which we'll talk more about in a second. So how does it do that? How does glucose increase glucose levels in the blood? Well, it's going to do it in 3 ways. Glycogenolysis is one way, gluconeogenesis is another way, and through the release of what's called ketone bodies. So let's talk first about glycogenolysis. And if you break that word down, it makes sense. Glyco refers to sugar like glucose, geno to generate, and lysis to break down. So glycogenolysis is where glucagon is released by the endocrine pancreas. It's going to target cells in the liver and encourage them to break down that complex carbohydrate we've talked about once before called glycogen, which is made up of lots of little glucose molecules all strung together. It's going to say, okay, liver, break down that glycogen so that we can release those glucose molecules as monosaccharides into the blood so that we can increase that blood glucose concentration. So glycogenolysis, that's where glucagon tells the liver to break down glycogen and release the glucose that was making it up into the blood. In gluconeogenesis, we're going to actually just create more glucose. And how it's going to do it is glucagon is going to basically tell skeletal muscles to break down that skeletal muscle protein to release amino acids. It's also going to tell adipose cells, fat cells, to break down fat and therefore release fatty acids. So with the combination of amino acids being released into the blood and fatty acids being released in the blood, these two can be put together, an anabolic reaction, put them together to create new glucose molecules that will then be released into the blood, and that increases the blood glucose concentration. So glycogenolysis means breaking stuff down to release glucose. Gluconeogenesis, making new glucose molecules to raise the blood sugar in the blood. And finally, the third one is ketone bodies. And if you've been into these diets, keto diets, you might know all about ketones. So ketones, as you see an example here, a ketone is one of these R groups, one of these sort of things that latches onto a lot of other compounds. It's just basically, some chemical combined to a carbon, there's another chemical on the other side, and then you have a double bond to an oxygen here. So that's a ketone. And it is synthesized in the liver from fatty acids. So someone who's on a ketone diet is not eating a lot of carbs, right? They're eating protein and fats. And that gives the raw materials to break those compounds down and release fatty acids. Well, when these ketones are produced and released into the bloodstream, they're going to start building up, and they can be metabolized by the heart and by skeletal muscle, things like that. And that is going to be a fuel source. However, as these ketones increase in concentration in the blood, it's going to lead to a lowering of pH in the blood. So, you don't want too much ketones in your blood. It could result in a condition called ketoacidosis, where the blood pH is getting lowered. And as you know, our blood pH has to stay right around 7.4 or you can be in trouble. So that is kind of like the last resort way that glucagon is going to increase glucose levels in the blood. It's really principally going to rely on glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So some of the things that can trigger glucagon to do these things. So we already mentioned when it detects that the blood glucose levels are declining, that'll kick in that negative feedback loop, and it'll do these things to raise that glucose level up. But also circulating catecholamines, and recall those are norepinephrine and epinephrine. And that makes sense, right? You're running from the lion, you need to fuel those muscles, you need a quick supply of sugar to do it, of glucose, because glucose is the starting point to produce ATP. And so, when it's signaled that you have these catecholamines, these stress response hormones, short-term stress response hormones circulating in the blood, then all of a sudden, okay, we need glucose produced, and that will cause the endocrine pancreas to produce glucagon, and so that these processes can occur to raise that blood sugar level so you can fuel those muscles. Similarly, you're going to get responses from the sympathetic nervous system, right? Fight or flight. And the only thing that's going to slow it down is when you're either having the blood sugar level getting way too high, the hypothalamus will eventually detect that, and you'll get it coming back down, or the production of somatostatin. And recall, that's the third hormone that these pancreatic islets can produce from those gamma. So somatostatin is going to inhibit the production of glucagon. Now, this chart over here is going to give you a nice summary of the differences between glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, so you can study that. And these two are a nice summary of how this glucagon negative feedback loop works. Glucose levels high versus glucose levels low. So are you going to be producing more glucagon, or are you going to be producing more insulin? So if blood glucose levels are low, kick in that glucagon to increase the glucose levels in the blood. If glucose levels are high, kick in insulin to bring them down. Now that we've talked about glucagon, let's talk about its antagonist, insulin. So again, glucagon and insulin are the two extremes of the feedback loop. They essentially do the opposite of each other. And so here's a 3D model of insulin. Probably you've heard of insulin before because you've probably heard of type 2 diabetes. It's kind of an epidemic right now in this country. So insulin does the opposite of glucagon, and that is that it is going to decrease the glucose concentration in the blood. And the way it's going to do that is stimulating cells to take that glucose up from the blood and take them inside themselves. So what's going to trigger this is when that blood glucose level is increasing. So this happens, for example, when you're eating. And also, as we said, it's happening because those glucagon levels are rising, telling the glucose levels to rise. So as that level rises, insulin's going to say, oh, okay, we have too much glucose in the blood. Let's get those cells to take it up so we can bring that concentration down. So it's all about homeostasis, of course. Now, what's going to suppress the production of insulin is the release of somatostatin. That's that inhibiting hormone. And as we know, it can be produced from those pancreatic islets in the endocrine pancreas. It also can be reduced by the sympathetic nervous system. So again, it's the antagonist to glucagon, and it's going to target the liver and the heart and the skeletal muscles and the brain. And it's going to, once it gets the signal, it's going to do the opposite of what glucagon did. So whereas glucagon was trying to break down glycogen to release glucose into the blood, we're going to have insulin telling the liver, no, let's make glycogen, because that's the way to store glucose for when we need it. So it's going to synthesize glycogen in the liver, an anabolic process, right? It's also going to do the opposite of what glucagon was doing. So whereas glucagon was going and gathering amino acids and fatty acids to make glucose through gluconeogenesis and release that glucose in the blood, insulin's going to say, oh, no, we don't want glucose in the blood. So let's take those little components, those fatty acids and the amino acids, and let's go ahead and get them taken up by cells so that they're not making any glucose. And so it's going to tell fat cells, the adipose tissue, let's make adipose tissue by taking all those lipids and those carbs and forming more fat. So remember, fat is a way to store energy. And in this sense, we're storing glucose, or the ability to make glucose, by taking those amino acids and those carbohydrates and turning them into fat. And then insulin is also going to be responsible for the feeling of satiety. So in other words, when you feel full after a meal, without insulin, you might keep eating, and that would keep raising the glucose levels. So insulin's going to tell you to think that you're full so that you stop eating, so you don't keep raising glucose levels in the blood. Now, what happens when that feedback loop is off? What happens when the production of insulin is out of whack, out of homeostasis? So you probably have heard these terms before: hypoglycemia and hyperglycemia. So hypo, that means low, right? So hypoglycemia is where the blood glucose concentration is getting too low because too much insulin is being produced. So when you're producing too much insulin, all that glucose is just being taken up by cells like crazy. And so your blood glucose level is essentially crashing. Your blood sugars are too low. Hyperglycemia, that means that too little insulin is being produced, or maybe it's not being produced at all, or it's being produced, but your cells just aren't sensitive to it. So in cases of hyperglycemia, the glucose level in the blood is too high, your blood sugar is too high, and that can lead to a condition called diabetes mellitus. And there's type 1 and type 2, as you probably have heard before. So type 1, the person is either not producing insulin at all, or they're producing too little insulin. And so there's just not enough insulin to tell cells to take up all that glucose that's in the blood. In type 2, often called adult onset diabetes, of which there is lots of cases of this in this country. In this case, you're still producing insulin, but the cells are not sensitive to it. So even though the message is getting there, something is keeping those cells from responding to that message and taking the glucose into the cells to decrease the blood sugar level. So you can kind of see that in this cartoon right here. So you can see, here's the glucose, and you're getting the insulin signals illustrated here in these little blue boxes here. So the insulin is binding to receptors on the plasma membrane of the cells, but for some reason, those receptors are not responding, and you don't get the signal there for the glucose to be taken up. So that's type 2 diabetes. It's insulin resistance in that sense. This little graphic is going to just summarize these negative feedback loops between glucagon and insulin. And over here, a nice little chart comparing what happens in hyperglycemia versus hypoglycemia. But take-home message here, insulin and glucagon are antagonists to each other. Insulin is going to decrease glucose concentration in the blood by getting cells to take up glucose, and glucagon is going to either produce or release or glucose into the blood to increase blood glucose concentration. So we're getting close to wrapping up our discussion of hormones from the endocrine system. So let's go through these kind of quickly. Next endocrine gland we're going to talk about is the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is located in the mediastinum, right above the heart. And what's interesting is it's very large in infants and children, and it shrinks over time as you're an adult. One reason why children have really good immune systems in general, whereas adults not so much. So you can see here in this infant right here. So there's the thymus gland right over the heart. And here it is, another view of it. And another view of it. So overall, the thymus gland is the site of maturation of T cells, which are involved with our immunity. And what's kind of neat here is that the hormones that are produced by the thymus gland are produce paracrine signals. So they're targeting nearby cells for these T cells to be matured. So there's two main hormones from the thymus gland, thymosin and thymopoietin. So here's thymosin here, and here's thymopoietin. So thymosin is going to promote the actual maturation of the T cells, whereas thymopoietin is going to basically direct T cells where they should go in the body. But together, they're responsible for the maturation and sending off T cells to where they need to go. So thymosin and thymopoietin are the hormones of the thymus gland. Now, let's talk about gonads. So we said that gonads produce hormones, and so these are testes or testicles in the male, ovaries in the female. So when we're talking about testes in the male, testes function for spermatogenesis, the production of sperm cells. We'll get into more detail about this when we get to the reproductive system. But overall, testes are going to produce the steroid hormone testosterone. And this testosterone is going to have anabolic effects. So it's involved in spermatogenesis, but it's also involved in bone and muscle growth and secondary sex characteristics. So these would be things like facial hair, deep voice, all these things you associate with males that produce testosterone. Ovaries are going to produce chemically similar hormones. They're both derived from cholesterol. Ovaries are going to produce estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen is what gives females their secondary sex characteristics, things like, the smaller bones, breasts. It's going to affect menstrual cycles and blood, bone, kidney, adipose development. Progesterone is kind of works hand in hand with estrogen, but it's going to help to prepare the body for pregnancy and maintain that pregnancy if one should occur. It acts on smooth muscles and also helps with blood clotting. And all of these are related to thermoregulation, bone density and growth, metabolism. So as one ages and you go towards menopause, obviously these levels of progesterone and estrogen change, and you can see why women can get all those typical symptoms of menopause, like hot flashes and fatigue and things like that. So this is kind of a cool little graphic that's just going to compare hormones produced by the testes, the testosterone, versus hormones produced by the ovaries, estrogen and progesterone. So another little good study tool here. Here is a picture of an ovary, and of course that's the uterus, and these are the fallopian tubes. That's the testis, and specifically this part right here. And over here, since we were just talking about the thymus, there's a thymus gland for you. Okay, so thymus producing thymosin and thymopoietin, testes producing testosterone, and ovaries producing estrogen and progesterone. Now, of course, there are other endocrine organs as well that you might not even think of as being endocrine organs or having endocrine functions. So we mentioned the pineal gland before. So that is right in the brain. It's actually in the epithalamus, which is the posterior part of the diencephalon in the brain. So it's this little bean-shaped thing that just sits in there, and it produces the hormone melatonin. And it's melatonin that is going to regulate our sleep-wake cycles. And you might know that you can actually purchase melatonin over the counter in any grocery store, and people take it if they're having trouble sleeping. But just keep in mind that your body naturally produces melatonin. And so, if it's registering that melatonin levels are high, feedback mechanisms are going to kick in to bring it down. So melatonin is naturally produced in response to decreasing light, which is why, when the sun goes down, you start getting sleepy because you start producing melatonin. So it's going to regulate sleep-wake cycles. So pineal gland produces melatonin, regulates sleep-wake cycles. Adipose tissue, fat, can also be considered to be endocrine because it produces hormones, including the hormone leptin. And leptin is the hormone that when it's produced, it tells your body that you're full. So it promotes satiety so you don't overeat. And how's it going to do that? Well, when it's released from fat, it will target the hypothalamus in the brain. That's going to say, okay, we're full, and stop encouraging eating. And the heart itself can be considered to be endocrine partly in function, and that is because it produces the hormone atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. And I know that's a mouthful, but atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. And this is kind of going to act opposite of aldosterone, for example. So if you recall, aldosterone produced from the adrenal cortex is going to work to raise blood pressure, raise fluid volume in the blood. So atrial natriuretic peptide is going to do the opposite. It's going to decrease fluid volume, blood volume, and therefore blood pressure. So it's going to act the opposite. Because it's in the heart, it's sensing what the blood pressure is. So it's going to be triggered because little proteins called stretch receptors are going to constantly be saying what is the blood volume, what is the blood pressure. And if it detects that those are too high because we're getting stretching of those blood vessels as that pressure is going through, it's going to send signals for those blood vessel smooth muscles to relax, causing vasodilation. And when there's vasodilation, there's more space for the blood fluid to go through. That decreases the pressure on the walls of those blood vessels. And one of the ways it does this is by telling the cells in the kidney tubules to excrete more sodium ions. And so remember that when you're putting more sodium into somewhere, that is increasing solute concentration, and that makes water want to follow because the water level's low when you're getting a bunch of sodium in there, and water wants to go from where it's more concentrated to where it's less. So it's going to follow that sodium to kind of dilute everything. And because this is happening in these kidney tubules, this process called natriuresis, and therefore natriuretic, it's going to cause an increase in urine output. So you're going to pee more when there's more ANP being released by the heart. And by peeing more, you're decreasing blood volume in the body, therefore decreasing the pressure on the blood vessel walls, and therefore decreasing blood pressure. So we're ready to wrap up our discussion of the endocrine system, and we're going to conclude talking about the kidneys, which can serve as secondary endocrine organs. So there are really three things that the kidneys are going to do for the body. So we're going to break these down and talk about each one. Now the kidneys, of course, average person has 2 of them. They kind of look like kidney beans on a larger scale, and they're found in the posterior back. So you got one on each side. So one of the hormones that kidneys are going to produce is something called erythropoietin, or EPO. Erythro means red, poietin production. So this is going to stimulate the red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells, more erythrocytes. It also is going to stimulate the red bone marrow to mature those red blood cells faster. So remember, they're no good to us until they're mature. So we're going to produce more and mature more red blood cells. And what's going to trigger this EPO to be released by the kidneys is when there's a detection of lowering oxygen levels in the blood. So remember, the whole reason why red blood cells are so important for us, or one of the reasons anyway, is that they transport oxygen to our other cells. You have to have oxygen to undergo cellular respiration and produce ATP. Well, if oxygen levels are low, you need more red blood cells so that there's more hemoglobin, more binding sites for oxygen to be transported. And so we need more red blood cells if your oxygen levels are low, and that's where EPO comes in, getting produced and released by the kidneys, telling that red bone marrow to hurry up with the red blood cells, get them out there. Secondly, kidneys can produce the hormone renin. And renin works hand in hand with aldosterone that we already talked about. So recall, aldosterone secreted from the adrenal cortex, and it works to raise blood pressure and raise body fluids. Well, renin does too. Renin is another part of that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS, that we talked about. And again, we'll talk a lot more about RAS later in our discussions of things like the urinary system. Well, that system, RAS system, works together to raise blood pressure, raise blood volume. And renin's role in that system is to convert a compound called angiotensin to a compound called angiotensin 1 in the blood. And all that's going to become important in raising blood pressure and overall helping to maintain blood pressure homeostasis. So stay tuned in the future. We'll talk a lot more about RAS, what an angiotensin 1, there's also an angiotensin 2. We'll be talking about that later on. But for now, just know that the kidneys in their endocrine function do produce renin, part of the RAS system, and helps to maintain blood pressure homeostasis by raising blood pressure. Finally, think back to PTH, parathyroid hormone, that we talked about. And we said one of the functions of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands is to help with the conversion of inactive vitamin D that you get from being out in the sun to the active form, vitamin D3 or calcitrol. That's a very important part of our body. It helps our immune system, for example. So the way parathyroid hormone is going to do that is by triggering cells of the kidneys. So the kidneys are the ones that are actually going to do the heavy lifting of converting that inactive vitamin D to calcitrol. So kidneys, in addition to all the other stuff they do with our urine and regulating electrolyte balance, kidneys are going to produce erythropoietin to produce and mature red blood cells in the red bone marrow, produce renin to help increase blood pressure, to help maintain blood pressures and homeostasis, and do the converting of inactive vitamin D to the active vitamin D3 or calcitrol. That's it for our discussion on the endocrine system. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.